Okay? So, that part there, if we look at page 5, okay, it says, so just go back to thinking of that hovering eagle. Above and beyond these three, they place the fourth, which the Greeks call synderesis. That spark of conscience, which was not extinguished even in Cain, just as by which, when overcome by pleasures or by rage, and sometimes when having been deceived by reason itself, we likewise feel our sinfulness. So, in other words, we can go completely off beam. We could make a stupid blunder, actually, in our judgment. And so, St. Jerome is saying, well, what can make us go wrong? Pleasure, so sensual pleasure. Rage, he's cranked it up. So in other words, if you're seeing red completely with anger, and then equally it says, sometimes having been deceived by reason itself. So in other words, you can make a mistake. Or someone could tell you something. At certain points we receive mixed messages. You know, someone could say, this is great, go for it. And then someone else says, no, don't touch it with a barge pole. And then you say, well, I don't know, what do I do? And so you pick one of them. You have to try and work out if you need to do it. It could be the wrong thing. So, deceived by reason itself. Okay? So he then says about this eagle, does this which they properly consider as the eagle, this conscience, who does not mix with the other three, but corrects their errors. This is a spirit who intercedes for us with indescribable groanings. Yet as it is said in Proverbs, when the wicked man has come to the depths of sin, he acts in contempt. Often we see this conscience being cast down and losing its place. Now, this, in that sense, is a complex text, and so the medieval spent centuries actually working on this and working away from it. But in effect, you have two parts there being described in the same paragraph. You have a portion of conscience that is correcting the things that have gone wrong, and at the end he uses the word conscience to say that it can go wrong itself. And that's why the medievals said, well, that's fine, this is actually our understanding, that deep down there's a bit that can never go wrong, our fundamental connection with God that wants us to do the good, but another part that can make stupid judgments. And that's really the difference between the two. Okay? So, there we are. That means that conscience is fallible. Now, if we have in modern times the idea of I don't want to do this because my conscience tells me not to do it. Equally, you could have a situation where my conscience tells me to do this, and it's really quite wrong. So let's say, for example, I strap bombs to myself, and I come into a room, look at how's that for timing, and and bang! Okay. So, fully convinced that this is right. Okay? So two parts to this question. Is it right? And is it good?
Sort of middle ground there, because in that person's mind, that person believes themselves that it is fully right and fully justified, and
okay.
Therefore that is why they have decided to do it, be it that they're weak of mind or spirit or whatever. Someone has impressed upon them that idea, and they believe fully convinced that it is right to do it. And is it right to do it or not? They're carrying out the action which they believe to be right, which has consequences for everybody else. But
okay. Well, let's say we have that horrendous trial just now of Anders Breivik. Okay. He, at the end of his trial, said, "I'm sorry, I didn't manage to blow up more people." That's what he said. Horrific. Absolutely horrific. And in that sense, the country was in shock. And yet, he felt he was totally justified and this was the right thing to do. He was condemned, and so in that sense he was sentenced and is in prison. Okay. Now, the question is that he was judged by society, he was judged by a court, by his own peers, to be wrong. Okay? So that means that there has to be a process whereby they can say this is wrong. Okay? So in fact we have lots of contradictions in society, whereby at certain points we have this idea that everything is up for grabs. And if I say that this is right, it's right. But in fact, if you go to a certain point, people say, no, I'm sorry, no, that's just no, that's totally unacceptable. Okay? And so underneath, we have that desire to say, this is right, that's wrong. So the question is, has that person acted in good faith? Is the person mistaken? What? So the person's acted for their own self. So let's say they're convinced, so let's move away from that particular case. Let's say, for example, that someone has done something because they thought it was right. Okay, it's just purely a mistake, but it's a serious mistake. Okay? Now, in the history of the church, what you had was a situation whereby St. Thomas Aquinas said two parts. One, if it's a big thing, his actual words are, you should know. That's basically it. In other words, if it's big enough, and if you think and reflect long enough, you should know. Okay? If it's a small thing, then mistakes happen in that sense. And if it's a sin, you confess. But at the same time, the large thing, you're not excused your guilt because you should have known. Okay?
This is handed down in the commandments to us, and we've got to live within the law that was handed to us.
Yeah. So in other words, there are external things that teach us, but also there's an internal law. Okay, it says in the scriptures, I will write my law on their hearts. Oh, I see, it's interesting. It's interesting how actually the two continually go together, conscience and heart. I will write my law on their hearts. Okay, and another passage maybe to discuss at 9 o'clock is the other Romans passage that looks at conscience and looks at hearts in relation to the Gentiles. In other words, you have the Jews with the law, and so St. Paul is reflecting upon, what about the pagan nations? Do they have an understanding of right and wrong, of God's law? And so he's saying, yes, it's written on their hearts. Okay. So St. Thomas Aquinas has the idea that really you need to reflect, you need to look at God's law from within and also what is taught, and you understand what is right and what is wrong. When we come to another character called William of Ockham, we'll hear more about that later on, William of Ockham changes the definition of an action. And so, in other words, he says, if I think it's good, if I think it's good, then that means that it is good. Actually. So in other words, I do this because that's my intention. It's a good intention. Okay? So my intention is a good intention, therefore it doesn't matter if it's actually bad. So let's say, for example, I have the intention of, let's say someone has a sick wife, and the man is poor, so he needs some money to buy some medicine. So he puts a gun to someone and says, stick him up. Okay? Now, there's a mixture of things going on in there. Okay? Is it a good act? No. That's also another thing you'll see in the other sheet. If there's a bit that's defective, it's bad. Okay? It's okay. He might have a good intention. So William of Ockham changed the idea that even though it's wrong, if you had a good intention, that means that it's all right. And that's actually gone right down through history to the point now that things are based upon opinion and intention purely. Okay? So that's why we can end up in a situation where someone can do something terribly bad, but at the same time someone could still think, well, but they meant well, and so it's understood as being good. Okay? Something to discuss maybe actually at part time. Okay, so basically the scholastics came up with the idea that conscience has dignity. Good. But conscience makes mistakes. So actually they declared two things. Conscience has dignity, conscience makes mistakes. Why does conscience have dignity? Because it's connected to God. That's it. And so in other words, if you separate God from conscience, according to the medievals, it loses its dignity. That's how fundamental. So St. Bonaventure said that conscience is God's herald and messenger. Okay? St. Thomas Aquinas said that conscience is the ambassador of the emperor. Sounds quite grand. Okay? The ambassador of the emperor. So you have two great scholastic teachers. So Franciscan and Dominican in the Middle Ages saying these things. Basically, conscience is speaking for God. And so if you are starting to live a life of sin, then it could be the case that you know, as you were saying, Julian, that you end up clouding that capacity to see the truth. And so in other words, things become dim and you're detaching the relationship between God and conscience. So we need to try and keep the two together so that conscience has dignity. Things, as they move through history now, we end up now in Moral Manuals, page 3, things are getting too complicated. So you're probably thinking, oh, well, no wonder. So things are getting too complicated. I wish you would stop. Priests were starting to travel, okay? And so they thought, well, this is getting a bit ridiculous. They've got to carry all these books about, and they've got to walk around. This is quite ridiculous. Let's give them smaller books, okay? So they started to reduce things. And one of the things they actually reduced was a breviary. And so you ended up having something you could carry rather than having monastic sets of prayer books. That was one element. But equally, when it came to studies, at the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominicans discussed whether they could cope with all that St. Thomas wrote. And so quite soon afterwards they said, no, it just looks too much. And so actually they went, and they cut chunks out of it and said, right, okay, you could read that bit. That's not so bad, okay? But even at that stage, it meant actually that it was losing, as Bishop Hugh was talking about, losing the big picture. You actually need to see the big picture in some of these things so that they fit together. So when it came to 16th, 17th century, they produced a thing called a moral manual. Okay? A manual, so in other words, a textbook for morals. So it allowed priests to have a handy textbook to help them to understand moral problems and to help people in confession. It's handy, it's okay, it sounds good, isn't it? You know, so it was a handy textbook. But what it did was, it was to try and make things easy, it simplified things. So how do you simplify? How do you simplify morals? Don't do it. So basically it focused on no. Okay, it focused on things that you aren't allowed to do, and then the other side to it is things I have to do. Okay? So let's say if you looked at the whole spread of possibility in morals, where do you focus? Let's say different people might focus on different things. One person might come in and say, do I have to do this? Another person might come and say, is this bad? Okay? Another person might say, what could I do? What are the positive things? Okay? It's actually 3 different ways of looking. The no is actually the most basic form that you build from.